Hello, and welcome to the John 3:15 podcast, the show where we break open the mysteries of the most popular and misunderstood Bible verses, and put them back into context. I am your host. They call me Jonathan Baggy Eyes Van Shank, and here is my co-host. They call him Jeremy Impending Baby Swingle. Now, Jeremy, why do they call you Impending Baby Swingle?
Oh, man. Because we almost weren't able to record this podcast. I mean, we're here and we're good, but just a couple weeks until our due date for our second child. So anytime,
nice, man.
Now, that's
nice.
pretty much all there is to it.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Man, I'm so happy for you and your wife. Like, guys, getting your second kid. The second kid is great. It's really sweet, and I'm like so excited for you guys.
I was so thrilled to wake up this morning and I realized that we were going to get to record this podcast about taxes instead of, finding out that my baby was coming, right?
Yeah. You got your priorities straight there, Jeremy.
It was definitely the most exciting moment of my day. No, I'm just kidding. I'm glad we get to spend some time together and talk about the Bible a little bit, but it might be the last time for a few weeks here. So
Right, yeah. So this means for our listening audience that likely this will be the last joint episode that we do for a little bit, because probably the baby's going to come soon here, and then you'll be on paternity leave, at least as far as the John 3:15 podcast is concerned, for a little while. And so who knows, maybe I'll throw out a few smaller solo episodes or something like that in the near future to keep the feed going. But unfortunately, we won't be able to finish our podcast series for a little bit here. But we do get to do one more episode before then. Sorry, I still have to explain why I'm Baggy Eyes Van Shank. I totally forgot.
It's because you already have a second baby, right? If I could guess. Yeah,
well, I mean, that partly. And then also our church is doing a prayer, a week of corporate prayer, and so I've been staying up too late doing prep for that and stuff. So I just it's not so much the second baby per se, but just bad sleep decisions.
And then you started fretting about taxes because you had to talk about it with me, right? And then
it's true.
The weight of the world pressed on you, and
yes, taxes. A theology of taxes is what's been keeping me awake. But
man, I'm really making this episode sound lame, but I'm actually super pumped to talk about it because these are some cool passages we got lined up.
Well, Jeremy, what is this episode that we're doing today? We've alluded, but what if somebody's just popped into our episode for the first time? Hello, newcomer, by the way.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of our series on politics and sort of dispelling a lot of rumors concerning various Bible passages and how they interface with politics. And this is our fourth sort of topic to cover. We started out with kind of like a general discussion of power and submission and, the greatest among you is the one who serves, right? So the posture of someone who is a public servant. And then we moved on from there to talk about an eye for an eye. So capital punishment and, just topics in that sphere of punishing people for crime, right? Mm-hmm. And then the last episode, we tackled Romans 13, the famous submit to the governing authorities passage. And today we're actually going to kind of continue in Romans 13, but it's going to be later. We have a primary passage in Matthew to tackle today, but we are going to hit the rest of Romans 13 because it concerns taxation. We've sort of been coming at this from a very liberty-minded perspective. John and I are both pretty anti-government in general, which has made it a convicting series for us because you've got these passages about submitting to the government and all that. But also people in the church do misinterpret these passages to give extra power and credence to the state that it shouldn't have, right? And so I think we're trying to walk that tightrope. And today might be the hardest one to walk the tightrope of because, man, I hate taxes. I just hate taxes. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do our best.
Yes. Well, that was a very nuanced way of putting it, Jeremy. Maybe for people who like it slightly more spicy. We get to find out today, is it true, as many libertarians say, that taxation is theft? Or is taxation a moral obligation that we must do in every circumstance?
Sure. And those are the only two options, right?
It's true. There's no gray area in between, no middle ground.
So the verse we're going to look at is in Matthew, and it says there's two things that are certain in life: death and taxes. Right?
Straight out of the Bible, man. Straight
out of the Bible, quoted by Jesus in the famous Sermon on the Mount. Obviously, no. Why don't you take us into it, John?
For
get us
sure.
going here with the meat.
Our first verse that we're going to be this is our center verse that we're going to be focusing on today, and this is from Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, the famous quotation of Jesus. I'm actually going to start in part B of the verse here. He says, Jesus answers them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And so, the verse here is basically, Jesus is coming out and saying, if we're, if you're asking about, paying taxes to Caesar, then you should render to Caesar. So give taxes to Caesar, and and give to God the things that are God's. But I mean, the important part really in this verse clearly is render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Yeah, pay your taxes, you subject, basicry.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, it's clearly what Jesus is saying. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it kind of is, though. We're going to get into it. Man, there are so many cool things in this passage that get missed that are, I just think, mind-blowing, that have nothing to do with taxes. So I'm excited to talk about it, because it's not that people are so completely wrong about what this verse is saying, but there's just like 100 things they're missing.
Yes, right. And that's the whole thing with the podcast, is we want to dig into the context and see, well, what is the passage actually saying, kind of in its fullest understanding.
Right,
Yeah, and so today, like Jeremy alluded to, we're actually going to be doing kind of 3 passages, 2 from the book of Matthew, and then 1, the last section in Romans 13 that we skipped last week. And so we're probably just going to kind of chug through all the passages and do our usual thing of stepping through the verses and seeing what it has to say, do a little bit of, as they say, exegesis, and then get to some applications near the end. So
we should probably clarify, John, that it wasn't last week that we released the previous episode.
Sorry. Okay, it's been a little while.
You have your preaching mode on, right?
I do. So it's just in my head of, well, that's second baby life, right? Anything that happened in the past was last week.
Just thought I would clarify. I'm not trying to roast you publicly.
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah, heavens know you roast me enough on this podcast. For sure. Well, Jeremy, how about you read us our first selection here from the book of Matthew?
Yeah, let's get some more of that context here. Airdropping into chapter 22, verse 15 through 22, and we're going to see what this broader discussion is that Jesus is having. So, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So that's our little section, our little pericope, we might say, just to prove that I got my money's worth at Bible college. That's a little pericope of Jesus and the Pharisees and the Herodians, and this coin, right? It's kind of the main characters here.
Yes, yeah, totally. Well, and so you said we're going to airdrop into the middle of Matthew 22. So now let's back up even a little bit more and think about, well, so we just got this story of these, people coming to Jesus and trying to trap him in his words, and then Jesus, does some great rhetorical jujitsu and, flips them on their back, classic Jesus. And, but there, it seems like there's a little bit of backstory that's sort of going on. And, it says, then the Pharisees went. And so, ostensibly there's something that's happened recently that's kind of instigating this particular event. And, another one is, maybe people don't just know off the top of their head, where broadly in the, story of Jesus's life does Matthew 22 actually happen. So let's just take a second and talk a little bit about the background context of, where this verse actually, where these verses actually show up. So this is, Matthew 22 is getting near the end of Jesus's ministry. So Jesus has actually just entered Jerusalem for the last time. That's the triumphal entry, with the palm branches and everything like that. And he's also just recently cleansed the temple. So he's like driven everybody out of the temple. And immediately after that, in Matthew's telling, there is kind of a series of conflicts and back and forth that Jesus has with the Pharisees immediately after he cleanses the temple. And he tells these series of parables where he's basically calling the Pharisees out and, saying that they're hypocrites and they're terrible and, they're not going to inherit God's kingdom and, telling all of these parables against the Pharisees. And it's that section of parables that's the instigation of the Pharisees then coming back. So it says, then the Pharisees went and plotted. The then, in this case, is, after Jesus tells all these parables against them. So Jesus has denounced and called out the Pharisees, and now they're kind of trying to respond. That's a little bit of sort of where we're sitting with things.
And that's a super important context. Like, that can't be just glossed over. The fact that they're trying to kill him by getting him to say something that will make the proper authorities angry at him is absolutely critical to understanding what's going on here. I mean, Jesus, again, like they say, they're flattering him. They say, you aren't swayed by appearances. You teach the way of God truthfully. It's true that Jesus isn't swayed by appearances, but he's also not trying to get people mad at him to kill him, right?
Right,
like,
yes.
So that context helps us understand why Jesus might give the answer he does. It's kind of a non-answer, although it's in many ways a much more brilliant answer than any of the ones they were expecting him to give, but he kind of doesn't play their game.
Yes.
That's immediately what we need to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
as we airdrop into this. Like they're playing
totally.
games with words. It's not like a congenial debate between someone who, thinks that, I don't know, we should ban shoelaces and someone who thinks we shouldn't ban shoelaces or whatever. It's a political topic, right? It's not a congenial debate among people who have an agreed upon set of rules and rhetoric. And it's like, no, they're trying to kill him.
Right. Yes. And no, that's really great to point out. One of the other things that I think is a little bit important for the context here, and that is maybe understanding more than just the elements of the story, but also a little bit of what Matthew is actually trying to do in the way that he has set this story in Matthew 22. So this first interaction that Jesus has with the Pharisees is actually one of a series of 4 interactions that Jesus has with a number of groups of people. So he has this interaction with the Pharisees and the Herodians, and then in just a moment, the Sadducees are about to come and ask him about marriage, which is the famous, if somebody, marries 7 people, and then in heaven, who is she going to be married to? That question. Then, immediately after that, the Pharisee lawyer comes and asks Jesus, what the greatest commandment is. Another really famous story about Jesus, answering questions. And then immediately after that, we get the again famous occurrence where Jesus challenges the Pharisees by asking them the question from Psalm 110:1 of this is the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And Jesus says, he sort of asks them this question of if David called this messianic figure Lord, how can he be his son? And he sort of goes into this whole thing there. And the important thing about it being these series of 4 questions is it actually turns out that during Passover week, which is the time frame where Jesus is actually in Jerusalem, there is a Passover tradition in the Jewish community where you kind of have this format where children are supposed to kind of have this question and answer period with their parents, kind of like during Passover. And so the format is basically the children, not to get too deep into it, but basically the children are supposed to ask their parents 3 questions, which then the parent answers. And then the parent responds by asking the children a question, and then they're supposed to answer. And so it kind of has this 4-question format of kids ask 3 things, and then the parent asks 1 thing. And so it seems to be that Matthew is sort of doing a little bit of a thematic setting here, where basically like all of the teachers, like the Pharisees and the Herodians and the Sadducees and the lawyers and all of the smart people are in this context like made to be like children in God's household, who are then like coming to God to ask him the 3 Passover questions, and then like Jesus answers them. And then it turns around where then, the father, the parent in the household, in this case, Jesus, then asks the children a question. And so I just want to point that out because I think it brings even more context to the passage, where it's the Pharisees are clearly trying to ask this like tricksy question of like catch you in your words, but Matthew is using it to like demonstrate, oh, like you guys are like kids. Like this is like the catechism questions that you're supposed to be asking, and let the parent just tell you how it is. So like super brutal takedown just with the way that the story is actually set.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Jesus is cautious about the ways in which he ticks off like the Pharisees, like he's not afraid to do it. But he doesn't do it haphazardly. He has these like clever ways of kind of like digging at their soul, like things that you need a commentary or like a really deep reading to like pick up on, these sorts of things, Yeah. So, it makes me think like, what if I went to my pastor and started asking him all sorts of like really easy questions, like, is the Holy Spirit God? Or like, basic like catechism questions and stuff.
Yes.
And then he comes back at me with this like extremely deep thing about like the connection between circumcision and baptism and the Old and the New Covenants. And I'm like, dude, I don't have an answer for you there.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, so with that kind of context, maybe let's dig into, let's kind of step through the passage and maybe make some observations before we get directly to the application of sort of what this chapter actually has to tell us about taxation. So, as I'm sort of like reading through the story, we've sort of already talked about why the Pharisees are upset with Jesus. And so, it says here that they sent their disciples to him. And so importantly, it's the specific Pharisees that Jesus has upset earlier with his parables are not the people who are actually asking him this question. It's the disciples of those Pharisees who are asking Jesus this question. And probably what's going on here is the Pharisees, it's the masters, the higher ups of the Pharisees who are the ones who, got denounced by the parables. And now they're like all sly-like telling, their, disciples or their trainees, or sort of like the lower downs, maybe the lower profile Pharisees, hey, go ask this question to Jesus to try to trap him in his words. And we actually even get this a little bit clearer in some of the parallel passages. So Luke, in chapter 20 actually has this same, telling of this story as well. And in there, it's the disciples, these disciples of the Pharisees are actually like explicitly called spies. And so the idea is that, it's these people who, they're low profile. You might not necessarily know that they're associated with the Pharisees per se, or at least not the Pharisees who were, just denounced earlier. And they're coming to try to like trap Jesus.
Do you think that's why they flatter him? Because I don't remember any other passages where Jesus is like so explicitly flattered by someone who comes to ask him a question. I mean, there's people who like Jesus and say nice things about him, but that's not flattery, whereas these people are definitely laying it on thick. Like, what's your opinion, you great teacher who teach the way of God truthfully and never say anything that isn't true, And
yes.
So maybe that's why I never really like connected that it was their disciples of the Pharisees and not the Pharisees, the big higher ups themselves. But I don't know, maybe that's why there's this flattery, just a guess.
Yes, no, I think you're exactly right.
Like, Jesus might not even know. I mean, he probably has the intuition because he's the Son of God, but they probably didn't come and identify themselves. Hey, we're the disciples of the Pharisees, the guys who you really don't like, and we love you, right. And here's all these great things. It's like probably not going to be as effective if they announce themselves to be.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No, so one of the other details that's really interesting here is it says along with the Herodians. So it's the disciples of the Pharisees and then this other group called the Herodians. Now, what's kind of interesting is the Herodians actually aren't mentioned in Mark's or Luke's telling of this guy. Well, actually, they're not in Luke's. I don't remember if they're in Mark or not. But
I don't think this passage is in Mark. Is this passage in Mark?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's in the three synoptics.
Oh, okay. Didn't know that. See?
Yeah.
Learn new things every day.
Yes, but it's interesting because Mark's is very, very similar to Luke's, and is not. There's a few details that are there's slightly different nuances in Matthew that are not shared in Mark and in Luke. And one of them is particularly that we're told that there's this additional group of people, these Herodians, who come along with the Pharisees. Now, just kind of a little bit of background, the Herodians are a group of Jews who were politically supportive of Herod, who was the king of Israel at this time. So, basically, historically in Israel, the Romans come and conquer, or basically take over and annex Israel, and then they set up this puppet king, Herod, who basically kind of rules on their behalf in Israel, and there's sort of a connection with the there's a connection with the Roman leadership that's there as well. But importantly, Herod he's the Jew who is kind of like the civil authority in Israel at this time. And so the Herodians are the people who support Herod politically. Now, it's actually kind of weird that Herodians are coming together with Pharisees to ask Jesus this question, because the Pharisees are not really the biggest fans of Herod or the Romans, really. And the Herodians, if they're supporters of Herod, like Herod was kind of this wicked, not really devout guy. And so it's a little strange that you'd have Herodians hanging out with these superstar religious people. They're kind of the political agitators. And so it's sort of this strange kind of pairing of these two people together. And I think Matthew's kind of doing that pretty intentionally to sort of highlight that there's sort of two different things that are going on here. You've got kind of this religious component to it and the civil component that's happening that are sort of coming together.
So I'm going to try to say this without making any sort of direct political connections to the modern day. But are you saying Jesus is like the populist person that both sides of the establishment are coming together to destroy? I'm honestly not. I know. Like when I said it in my mind, I was like, "That's funny." I'm not trying to make any direct connections to any contemporary events, but it does evoke some contemporary feelings.
I mean, there is something to these are both establishment groups who staunchly disagree with one another, who are kind of coming together for the purpose of destroying someone with popular support. So there maybe is a little bit of something going on there.
Maybe a little bit of yeah. These two people who are supposedly at war with each other are actually more on the same team than they appear to be. Than maybe they themselves even realize. They're willing to make these alliances with each other to destroy, this Jesus, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so it's weird that these two groups are coming together. One of the other things is we already sort of talked about their flattery, that they're saying like all these things and, it's likely to sort of hide their intentions is kind of why they're doing this flattery of trying to trap Jesus in his words. And in fact, actually in some of the other gospel tellings, we get it even more explicitly that they're like the purpose of what they're doing is, trying to trap him in his words so that they could hand him over to the authorities. I think it's either Mark or Luke that has that explicit detail. So they're like using this flattery to put him off guard for the specific intention of trying to hand him over to the Romans to be killed. Like that is why they are asking this question.
Yeah, like now that we've said you're a really good Jew and you teach the way of God correctly, maybe now you'll let your guard down a little bit and just rail on the Roman government and, provide this extreme anarchist manifesto against the paying of taxes. And then, we gotcha,
Yep, there it is. Yeah, exactly right. No. But it is interesting. The question that they do ask him, if I can sort of hit off that a little bit, is they don't ask like, is it, should we pay taxes to Caesar, or what do you think about taxes to paying taxes to Caesar? They specifically ask him if it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. And for the Pharisees, this would be a very, very important question. So they're actually making they're asking a question about how the law of Moses, God's law, what does it have to say about paying taxes to civil authorities? Sort of their piece. And And their question actually is a really good trap for, someone who's not the Son of God. Because it's like, how does Jesus come out against this? Like, ostensibly the Pharisees, being these religious leaders who really are pretty hardcore about the law and really hate the Romans, in all likelihood, the Pharisees would be pretty anti-tax, or anti-Roman tax specifically in this case. That they would probably have some notion of, God is our king, God is our ruler, so paying taxes to this other, civil authority who claims to be God is, they would probably construct it as some kind of blasphemy. And so in all likelihood, they would make some kind of lawful, law argument about how it probably isn't lawful to pay taxes to Caesar because God is your king, not Caesar, or, something along those lines.
Well, yeah, let's not forget the Pharisees themselves were kind of a populist group. They were against the Roman occupation, generally speaking. They weren't zealots. They weren't taking up the sword, but they were advocating people, adopt a sort of radical, personal, Jewish, faith and morality, which sort of saw the Roman government as, frankly, it's really not that different than a proper, evangelical theology of politics, which is we live in America, but our citizenship is in heaven.
Yes.
So whatever the government does, whether we oppose it or not, this isn't really our home. We want to make it a good place, but it's not really,
Yes, we're living in exile here.
We're living in exile, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Pharisees actually have kind of an interesting... the Pharisees aren't as wrong as people like to think. Jesus' main criticism of the Pharisees isn't that they're always theologically wrong, but that they don't practice what they preach,
Yes. Yeah.
But so that's my little spiel on the Pharisees. But I would guess that, they are generally kind of against Roman taxation, and probably they're debating among themselves. I don't have any historical sources on this, but knowing what I know about them, the Sadducees are probably 100% pro-tax because they're establishment as it gets, right? They are the old guard, kind of, we keep the whatever traditions, and the Pharisees are the people who are putting out podcasts, they're the Joe Rogans of the, I can't help but compare this to the modern day, but that is kind of what it is. They're speaking directly to the people. That the people want to know, how can I have Jewish piety? And the Pharisees are talking to them. And so I would imagine there are debates about this, even though I didn't dig into the rabbinic sources and, curse me for that. Now I'm just randomly guessing on our podcast now that you brought it up.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't know too much about the Sadducees, so maybe they were pro-tax, maybe they weren't. But the other thing, interestingly, likely the Herodians were at least pragmatically pro-tax.
This is a guess. I guess that makes sense, right? They're like Herod.
Yes, yeah. So if they like Herod, they like the establishment guy. Part of the tax. They do the Herodians do not want to upset the status quo at all. And saying something like you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar is a great way to upset the status quo. And so even if the Herodians don't like paying taxes or don't like the Romans, they like the status quo and would, in all likelihood, not want to upset that. And I think that's part of why Matthew includes the Herodians in this whole thing, is that you sort of have the two ideas here of, the religious law claim of, it's blasphemy to pay this tax, versus the Herodians of, we can't upset the status quo, don't, bring the Romans down on our head. And sort of however Jesus comes out on whether it's lawful to pay taxes, he's sort of stuck of, either he's, compromises his religious claims or his populist claims of, being this religious teacher. Because what's he doing, out there shilling for Rome, if he comes out pro-tax. But if he comes out anti-tax, then, they're going to take him to the Romans and be like, this seditious person, here, and then, kill him. So, Jesus, we're sort of like, okay, Jesus, how do you get yourself out of this one, basically?
Oh, he has his ways.
Yes. So it's so how does Jesus respond? He says, well, first of all, he calls them hypocrites, and so there's this great thing of Jesus knows their intentions, which is always stood out to me as kind of funny because we've already had several instances in the book of Matthew of Jesus demonstrating supernatural knowledge of people's intentions, to Pharisees. So it's a little silly of you guys already kind of have tried this sort of thing. Why are you doing this again?
It says stuff like he perceives in his spirit that they were, thinking this, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to I'm gonna go off on a limb here, and I'm gonna guess, although I don't know that it's said specifically, but my feeling is that this wasn't Jesus relying on his supernatural knowledge. My feeling is that this was, I mean, certainly the Holy Spirit is within him, but my feeling is that Jesus is just really good at reading people because he's perfect and he's sinless. I think he's just really good at understanding what people's true intentions are. Yeah. Right. I mean, you know, it's hard to say, but that's always been my guess. Like, he just knows that they're tricking him because he's brilliant and he's studied the Word of God and he knows the intentions of people's hearts. So he doesn't need to rely on his perfect knowledge necessarily to know this.
Yeah. In all likelihood.
I don't know. That's just my guess. That's how I like to read it, at least.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Jesus calls him out for hypocrisy. And the next thing he says is, you know, bring me the coin for the tax. And it says, you know, and so they brought him a denarius. And it's actually really interesting that we get the detail about what coin it is, because often in the New Testament, coins are described as like a silver coin or, you know, something like this. You don't get the actual name of what the coin was that was actually brought. And so it's really interesting here that we are told the name of the specific coin. So, you know, ostensibly there's multiple kinds of coinage that are sort of floating around at the time. And
drachma.
This is one. Yeah, drachma or, you know, denarius. And depending on your translation, sometimes you get the name, sometimes you don't. But here specifically, you do get the name. And, you know, I did a little bit of background research on this. And so a denarius is, you know, it's about like a day's wages. Some of the commentaries I was reading estimates that like in modern day dollars it'd be something like 50 cents, which gives you a sense of like how much more wealthy our society has become, that like, you know, the value of a day laborer's efforts is, you know, worth a lot more than 50 cents now. But at least back in the day, this is like what you would get if you were a day laborer. And, you know, so that's kind of like the amount of money. But more importantly, I think, is what the coin actually looks like. Because it's important that Jesus doesn't just ask them what the coin is, but he actually has them bring him the coin itself. And so in all likelihood, this denarius coin would be the coin it would have had stamped on it the face of the current emperor, which in this case would be Tiberius during this period of time. And so it's got Tiberius's face on it. And then it also has a inscription on it. And Jesus actually asks them, it's like, whose likeness and inscription is on the coin? And so he's highlighting there's both like a face stamped on it and then something written on it as well. And it's really fascinating because the thing that's written on the coin is, you know, this inscription describing Tiberius. And it says that it calls Tiberius God and High Priest. So it calls him, you know, in this case, high priest of the Roman religion in this case. And so it's really, really fascinating that it's this face of Caesar and this claim of he is God and high priest is like what's written on the coin. And so there's this really interesting thing of like Jesus, like everybody would have known what a denarius looked like during this time. And so it's really, it sticks with me that Jesus has them bring the actual coin to like hold up and show people, you know. It's like Jesus is sort of doing this object lesson where it's like, it's not just imagine the coin. It's like, no, look at the coin, like hold the coin up and, you know, see me, Jesus, the Son of God, the true high priest, the king over everything, and hold up this like tiny silver coin with the face of this man far away who claims to be God, claims to be high priest. And, you know, and let's put the two things up against each other and really see what the reality of the situation is.
Yeah, that would be a striking picture.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you could have your dinky coin, right, with Tiberius's tiny little pathetic face on it, right? Yeah. Or you could worship me, the true God and King of Kings on earth, right, who comes to crush Tiberius Caesar, right? Yeah. It's like, it really kind of makes it stark. Now, even me, like I already like Jesus, but now I'm like thinking about it, I'm like, man, that really does put it in perspective when I go on TurboTax to do my taxes. Is it really worth getting all that angry about, right?
Yeah. And you know, and one of the other things that sticks out is Jesus asked them like whose likeness and inscription, and the ESV renders it likeness. A lot of other translations render it as image, and that's kind of really the word that's going on in the background. And particularly in biblical, usage, the word image has kind of a lot of underlying kind of background meaning to it. So like one of them is, this notion of images are connected with idolatry, so that like, worshiping graven images or, things like this. So that image is sort of this idea of having an idol or, some kind of false god, this image of it. But it also has this connection to the image of God, that, we as created beings are made in God's image. And so I think Matthew is kind of trying to slip a little bit in here of getting us thinking. It's, you've got this image of Caesar, like this idol of Caesar that you're holding, and it's being contrasted with something, because we're about to get to a contrast here. And so what is the contrasting image that's sort of floating around, all over the place here? And I think Matthew is wanting us to see the contrast of image of Caesar versus image of God is I think the contrast that we're getting to. And I think that helps us really understand the point that Jesus is actually making here. When he says, render to Caesar the things which are Caesar's and render to God the things which are God's, is, on the first level, Jesus is just answering their question. They're saying, is it lawful to pay taxes? And he says, hold up the coin. Whose face is on it? Caesar's face. I mean, just give him his coin. Like,
it's a simple answer in one way. Like
right.
It's deceptively simple.
Yes. But then he turns it around and says, but render to God the things that are God's. And it's this like lesser to greater argument that Jesus is making. It's like, if Caesar is owed this coin by virtue of his image being stamped on it, it's like, are not we then owing ourselves to God by virtue of his image being stamped in us?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of this passage. That's always what I've seen as like the thing people miss. So I'm glad you brought that up. Like I mentioned earlier, there's like 100 things people miss. This is like the big E on the eye chart, the point of this passage. It drives me nuts that people will read this and think like, oh, so Jesus says pay your taxes. It's like, oh my goodness. He does say that. It's also not even like anywhere close to the main point of the passage. You're completely taking out the very last phrase, the punchy point that Jesus is making. And to God, what is God's? Well, what is God's? Like, that's not the coin. There's more going on to what Jesus just said than pay your taxes to Caesar, And so it's kind of used as a proof text against maybe like anti-taxation views, and instead it's like, but you miss the whole point. It's like you're still making this passage about the taxation when Jesus is trying to move them away from that to a more important topic, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so let's, maybe with that point, let's jump into saying, so then like, what does this passage actually tell us about taxation? And, given the fact that, I would make the argument, I don't think it really does tell us all that much about taxation. And it tells us some things, but not everything. And the reason why I make that point is, like, the story really is about how we owe ourselves to God. Like, we should honor God as Lord. We should not give to anyone else the things that we should give to God, namely our own lives. And it's like, and I think that's the thing that really causes the Pharisees and Herodians to marvel when they, leave, is this response that Jesus gives, if he's making this bigger point. And it's almost like the taxation backdrop is like incidental to the story, where it's not even really the point that Jesus is making. It's like more, it's this masterful Jesus is almost sidestepping the issue to get at something else. And so it's a little bit strange that we are basically falling into the same trap as, or the same issue that the Pharisees and Herodians are falling into when we try to make this passage about taxation, because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it about taxation, and Jesus is saying, well, yes, but here's what's really important. And then we're over there being like, no, Jesus, but come back to that tax thing. Like, tell me more about the taxes.
Well, so Jesus is, the topic of the discussion is taxation, but the point and the theology of the passage is not. I think that's like, and I guess the way that you would describe it in like debate or logic terms would be, you've got these horns of a dilemma that are about taxation. And one way that you can escape one way that you can, get away from having to spear yourself on either horn of a dilemma is to just escape the horns. Right.
Yes.
That's what. So to just diffuse the whole situation and say there actually aren't two sides to this question. It's a false dichotomy. And, the answer is not either of these horns. The answer is a completely different bull, right? With a completely different set of horns, perhaps, So I'm just going to ignore this
much longer and much pokier.
Right, yeah. So he's escaping the horns of a dilemma. Like rhetorically, that's what Jesus is doing. He's taking the topic and he's sidestepping it, like you said. But not because he doesn't have an answer. He does answer their question, but he also kind of poo-poos the question at the same time. He reveals the folly of their questioning. Jesus is so good at this. Like, every time he has these disputations, he just destroys the Pharisees with facts and logic. Right?
Yep. It's
utterly
great.
Destroys them.
Yes.
And he is so good at, like, and there's a lesson here for us in, since we're talking about politics, maybe a little side lesson here that we can learn from Jesus when we talk about, like, difficult issues, politics, ethics, etc. with our friends. And we have to evaluate if a discussion is worth having. We have to evaluate when people are just using words to try to hurt people or try to win one over, or we have to discern between someone we are disagreeing with and someone who doesn't mean well, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of not meaning well these days in political discourse. So, like, it's the whole pearls before swine thing, right? Paul does similar things in Romans. When he's talking about people who say, why not do evil that good may come if, we're saved by faith alone, right? And then he basically says their condemnation is just. I love that.
It doesn't even answer.
He refuses to. I mean, he does answer their question later on, kind of, but basically he just says these people are slanderers and their condemnation is just and they don't merit a response, right? And that's kind of Jesus's approach here. It's not the same, but it's the same mentality of, like, your guy's question, you're trying to kill me. You're trying to betray me into the hands of people you don't even like just because you hate me so much, right? So I refuse to play by your game. I'm going to escape the horns of this dilemma and reveal the folly of your question. And that's his approach. Now, and Jesus is a lot better at this than probably most of us are. All of us, so... and it is a masterful escape from the dilemma, because it's like,
think about the Pharisees who are going to try to, like, use this thing. It's like, on the one hand, Jesus said pay the taxes, so, like, oh, he is supporting the Roman oppressors, these blasphemous people. But it's like, but then if you're going to say, well, we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, it's like, oh, so do you not owe God the things that are God's? And
yeah, well, and the way that he does it, it's interesting. Like, it's good that you pointed out, like, that the question was whether it was lawful or not, because that is a very different question than whether it's right or not.
Yeah. Or whether you should do it. Right.
Particularly in this context, it's just like, is it okay to pay tax? Because that's an actual debate. You have this coin with a graven image on it, right? It's a Caesar who considers himself to be a god, and there's an inscription on it basically saying, I'm God, worship me, right? And you can easily see, like, let's say today, if the US dollar started becoming, like, much more openly blasphemous, right? And it declared Thomas Jefferson to be a god amongst men, right? Or whatever.
Yes.
George Washington founded the earth, right? Like, whatever sort of, like, crazy cult of personality worship, we might put on it, then some Christians would probably say, like, we should stop using the dollar. Like, time to hodl some Bitcoin, right? Like, let's stop using it. And it would be an understandable conclusion. I wouldn't agree, though, because of this passage in Matthew. Jesus is sort of, like, disabusing his audience of this, like, idea that, like, because we live in this world that is tainted with idolatry and a lot of, sin, that we somehow, like, can't just live normal life the best we can. It's like, whatever, it's Caesar's image on the coin. He's the one who bears the guilt for calling himself God and going around declaring himself to be this, big shot, right? You're not at fault of his sin for using a coin to do commerce in the real world, right? And if a tax collector comes to your door and he's going to kill you or imprison you or whatever if you fail to pay your taxes, you're not disobeying God to just pay your taxes. It's just a coin, right? And it's similar to what Paul says with, like, meat sacrificed to idols.
I was just about to say, sounds like, is an idol anything, right?
Right. It's like, whatever, eat the meat sacrificed to idols. Idols, they don't even exist, right? Like, stop putting so much stock in this thing that's not even real. It's meat. Thank the Lord for the meat. In your heart that it's not, like, pagan meat, right?
Yeah.
Even though it was, you know, sacrificed to an idol. And so, I mean, we could draw similar parallels to, like, you know, if you're in the stock market, you are supporting some sort of company that's doing horrendously evil things, and you don't know it, right? Your mutual fund is going to some awful company. I don't think that means you can't have a mutual fund. Just, you know, that's my little 2 cents there. Like, you can't help but be a part of the sinful world economy to some extent. At some point, something you're doing is affecting some other thing, which is doing something bad. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing we can do about that. You know, Caesar put his image on the coin. God will judge him for that, not you. Mm-hmm. I guess that's kind of what I see here, as something else that people might be missing because of that. Is it lawful? Detail to the question. Anyways. Yeah.
Oh man, Jeremy, we're totally going to get kicked out of libertarianism for this. Not only have we upset, you know, all of the, you know, anarchists, you know, who are staunchly against, you know, taxation, but now we've upset the agorists too.
Well, that's okay. They're wrong anyways. So well, but agorism is biblically wrong. Okay, let's tackle this for the 0 people who listen. That's actually not true. We do have a few people listening who know what agorism is, I think.
Sorry, yes.
But
could you give us the 30-second version?
Sure. Agorism is basically the viewpoint that since the government is hopelessly corrupt, we should, you know, live off the grid, and there's different, like, levels of it, you know, like we should not take any government welfare, for example. Now that would be like basic agorism, but it goes all the way to, like, don't connect to the public water and sewer and try to avoid, you know, I mean, you're not gonna be able to avoid, like, government roads or whatever, but for the most part, completely abstain from this system.
And it's basically opt out.
Yeah. And I don't hate agorists or anything, but biblically it's not, you cannot obligate people to have that viewpoint, because you have, like, John the Baptist in Luke, people are coming to him in repentance, and you have, like, I think, like, a soldier comes to him, and he's like, you know, what should I do for repentance? And the agorist's answer would be, well, you need to immediately stop working for the Roman government. Are you kidding me? They're pagan and evil, right? But John the Baptist's answer is, be content with your wages. Which is so good. It's such a good answer. Like, you know, he's probably expecting some radical, like, dude, take up your sword and start killing the Romans because you got to join the Jewish side, you know.
Yes.
and John's just like, you know, you should probably thank the Lord for the food on your plate, right? So, anyways, agorism is unbiblical, or at least it's unbiblical to require it of people. I think if your conscience is, you know, I want to be apart from the system, well, then that's fine, you know. But anyways, that's my little spiel. You can work for the local post office and still be an obedient, faithful Christian, right? It doesn't matter that it's part of a secular government.
Right. Well, so we've tackled here the one passage in Matthew talking about civil taxes, and I think it leaves us actually with more questions about how we should think about taxes biblically than maybe it answers from, you know, what would appear to be a very clear, you know, render unto Caesar. It's like, I feel like I'm like, well, I need to know a little bit more. So how about we dig into some other passages that also talk about taxation and see kind of what else the Bible has to say about it. So we're going to jump backward a few chapters here to another story that happens in the book of Matthew, which is also related to taxes. So Jeremy, how about you read us this next passage that we're going to here?
Yeah, totally. This is a fun one. Chapter 17. So this is earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. Important to perhaps keep that in mind. Verses 24 through 27. And if I'm not mistaken, does this only happen in Matthew? I don't recall off the top of my head.
Ooh, I didn't check.
Okay. Maybe we'll pull that up in a second. But
well, and actually maybe I'll give people the context. So, you know, the previous chapter in 22 that we were just looking at is Jesus in Jerusalem after triumphal entry. This story that we're going to get is actually Jesus in Capernaum, which is like way to the north of Jerusalem. And it's actually like near the end of Jesus's ministry. So it's like post-transfiguration, but it's before Jesus like enters Jerusalem. So it's kind of like we've just gotten Jesus who's like doing the predicting his betrayal and death to his disciples. And it's the second time in Matthew that Jesus has done that. He's going to do it one more time before the actual triumphal entry. But we are winding down in Jesus's ministry, and like we're coming to the end, but it's not quite over yet. And so that's sort of where we're at. So outside of Jerusalem, way to the north, near the end of his ministry.
Cool. All right. So starting in 17 verse 24, when they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax, that's like the temple tax, I believe, went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, by the way, I think Peter is saying, yes, he does pay the tax. That's a little actually confusing in the ESV. I'm pretty certain.
Yeah, well, actually, let me stop for a second.
Yes, he does pay the tax. That's what Peter's saying.
Yes. And the question that they're actually asking here is, from the commentaries that I was reading, is really not translated well into English, in this case, to give you the nuance of what's actually happening. Apparently, in the Greek, the way that these people are asking the question is, it's much more like your teacher pays this tax, right?
So you're getting into like the way you phrase a question in Greek ends up impacting whether the implied answer is a yes or a no.
Right.
Yeah. That's a huge thing in Greek.
Yes. Yeah. So they are asking this question and expecting Peter to say yes, and he does.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they did their best in the ESV. It is a little hard to get that nuance. I actually, for Christmas, I just got a book that's literally just about that topic, about questions and discourse. And dude, I haven't started reading it yet, but I'm pretty pumped.
That sounds great.
Maybe 3 months from now, we'll jump in and be like, oh, we got this passage all wrong.
There we go. We'll cut in right here and re-upload the video with Jeremy from the future if we were super wrong.
Anyways, yes, it's a fascinating thing in Greek analysis. But okay, so Peter just said, yes, he does pay this 2 drachma tax. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself."
All right.
Kind of crazy, huh? Like, you gotta do your taxes, just go fishing.
yeah, there we go. Well, I mean, if we were want to doing like hyper allegorical interpretations, maybe there is something here of, if you need to pay your taxes, maybe you just need to work, go out and get a job, or something like that, which I do not think that's what this passage is saying.
No. Hello there, Origin.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So just maybe a few details for helping us understand. So we have 2 drachma, the 2 drachma tax in this case. And this is referring to, you're correct, Jeremy, it's the quote temple tax, which is what is being discussed here. So it's a levy that was put upon people, but it's specifically like a religious levy. And so there isn't any necessarily like civil punishment for it. It's not like the Romans are going to come and kick down your door if you don't pay the temple tax. And so maybe tax isn't quite the best way of describing it. But there's a whole lot of social pressure for people to pay the temple tax. Kind of the idea is it's based off of a passage in Exodus where the people of Israel are required to pay like a certain sum of money for the upkeep of the temple, and it sort of then got interpreted as this ongoing thing where people are to pay a small sum of money yearly for the purpose of being able to maintain the upkeep of the temple. And it kind of became this symbol in societally of a way of like expressing your support for the religious system of Israel. And some people would kind of see it as this, you're fighting against the Romans or subverting the Romans by, supporting the temple is kind of a little bit of what's going on in the background here. And so, when they cruise up to Capernaum, again, which is pretty far away from Jerusalem, it's, probably there's this guy in a booth near the entrance of the city who you can come there sometime during the year and give him the 2 drachma tax, and then he'll like take it down to Jerusalem for you. So you don't necessarily need to go to the temple yourself. And so that's kind of what's going on here. One of the other pieces is a drachma. It turns out is about the same amount of money as a denarius. So it's about a day's wages. So in this case, actually, it's twice as much as the Roman tax that gets talked about later. So it's a 2-day wage tax, not a 1-day wage tax. So that's one piece. And then maybe the final piece, and then we can stop talking about like the finances that are going on here, is when Peter opens the mouth when Jesus says you'll open the mouth and find a shekel. It turns out a shekel is about 4 drachmas worth of money, and so it was exactly the right sum to pay Peter's temple tax and Jesus's temple tax. And so that's kind of what's going on here is there's that. So, but Jeremy, maybe talk to us a little bit about what is the analogy that Jesus is using in the middle of this story, and kind of what is his point that he's talking about here?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This passage can probably go in lots of directions. So I'm curious to see where we go with this, because I think there's a lot going on. But so Jesus asks Peter, so when the kings of the earth, so he's talking about Herod, he's talking about civil rulers, Tiberius, right? He asks Peter who they tax, whom are taxed by these rulers. Do they tax their own sons, or do they tax other people? It's a really easy question. Like, Peter yes. probably thinks like, oh, I finally know the answer to this one, right? Like, yes. Man, my master's going to be so proud of me.
And he gets to look good in front of the disciples. It's great.
Like, Rabbi, pick on me. I get a gold star, right? It's like, so he just answers from others, and it's like total, easy
it's
question.
A Sunday school answer.
Like, right, yeah. It's like he answers Jesus. It's like, wait, no. God? So Peter gives the obvious answer that Jesus is kind of just doing this rhetorically, right? Peter says, well, obviously it's from other people, not from their own children. And then Jesus says to him, well, then the sons are free. Okay, so the sons aren't taxed. What's your point, Jesus, right? That's obvious. That's just how the way the world works. But then Jesus doesn't comment on it any further. He's just done. He doesn't say anything else. He just says, go catch this fish, and then you'll have the tax money and give it to them. And then you can cover my tax and yours. While you're at it, Peter, why don't you, cover me, right? I got important things to do here. I'm the rabbi, right? Like, I'll do the miracle, but you got to go catch the fish, man. Like, I just love these little moments with Jesus and his disciples. It's so funny. Like, imagine being Peter. But Jesus doesn't actually explain this analogy. He just says, well, the kings don't tax their own sons, do they? And what's interesting here is, well, so let's think about the temple tax. If you were, say, a Levite, so someone part of the tribe of Levi whose literal job it was to, keep the upkeep of the temple, then you were not subject to the same taxation, and in general, a lot of the same laws as were, people of the other tribes of Israel, right? So there is this idea that some people are taxed and others aren't taxed. Some are obligated and some are not. And in civil rulership, kings of the earth, their sons don't pay taxes, but others do. And when it comes to the temple, which is the topic of discussion here, this is the kind of tax, some are exempt from the tax and others aren't. There's a concept for that in the Old Testament. But then Jesus is bringing this up in this context, but he doesn't explain it. And that's why I think it could go in lots of directions. I will say how I've always understood it, or at least always, ever since I first thought deeply about this passage. And then I'm curious if you disagree, John.
Okay, yeah, hit me with that.
Yeah, but the way I've always understood it is basically, he's implying that he is this, priest, right? Jesus is the great high priest. So he is exempt from the temple tax rightfully because he, is analogous to this, group of Levites, right? He would be exempt from the tax. And by extension, his disciples would also be free from the tax because after all, we could bring in other theology here, we are Christ's brothers from Hebrews 2, but just, in general, he doesn't say then the son is free. He says the sons are free. I think Jesus is implying, especially because Peter's tax is in view here as well, that Peter is also exempt from the temple tax rightfully. And then he goes on to say, but in order to not give offense to them, go catch this fish and pay our tax. So he says, like, this tax shouldn't be binding on us because we are, after all, the true inheritors of everything that the temple means, you and I, Peter. But there's no reason to cause undue offense, right? They don't get that yet. So let's just go pay the tax. It's like a pragmatic sort of concession to the circumstances. That's how I've always seen it. So I don't think this passage is in general saying that like taxes are always wrong, or it's like it's never okay for a government to tax. I think that would be pushing the text beyond what it says. I think what Jesus is saying is the temple tax is unjust on people who literally are gonna be the temple of the Holy Spirit once I resurrect and bring the Spirit on Pentecost, right? Mm-hmm. I've always understood it that way.
Yes,
maybe
I think,
made sense. Maybe it didn't.
No, I think you did a great job. And I think I generally agree with the points that you'd make there. I think the direction that I would go with it is I'd say, I'm not sure that this passage is even talking about civil taxation at all. Because and maybe you could loop some of it in because there wasn't as fine of a distinction between civil and religious authorities back in the day. But I think the point really that Jesus is making is about our financial obligations. And, that where taxation is one of those obligations, this temple tax is one of those obligations. And, what Jesus is saying is, I think you're exactly right, that Jesus himself, and by extension his disciples as being part of God's family, are not obligated to pay God's tax, kind of in this sense. But to say that, I think there is kind of this backdrop of saying, well, maybe there are some financial obligations that are binding on people. Not this one necessarily, and there's an argument why this one would not be binding on us, but maybe there are some that are binding on people. And so I'll just kind of let that sit there and we'll come back to it in a little bit. But more importantly, Jesus makes this really big pragmatic argument that he says it's not binding, but you should pay it anyway.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's actually probably going to be the more important thing to draw from this passage today.
Yes. And it's so as to not offend them or so as not to give offense. And from the reading that I was doing is, I think we should understand the them in this case to be referring to, like, broadly the people who live in Capernaum. Capernaum? I always go back and forth. I say
Capernaum, potato.
Okay. Capernaum. I'll shorten it. The people of Capernaum. And, so that there's the sense in which, Jesus is not paying the temple tax, that would be something that would be offensive to people of like, what, are you not for the temple? Are you not for a religious system? Like, are you a dissident against this thing that God has given to us? Could be what someone might think. And I think that it's important that Jesus is definitely doesn't have a problem with offending people. If there's, if he has some strategic value for doing so. Like,
right.
We're about to...
Yeah. It's unusual to see Jesus saying, hey, just let's not be offensive, right? Let's not get carried away now here, Peter.
Right, yeah. Jesus offends tons of people and does it intentionally. But that Jesus seems to be making this other point of, but there's sometimes when it's not worth it to offend people. Which I think is kind of what Jesus is saying, is that in this case, just pay the tax. It's not that much money. Just do it because people aren't going to understand and they're going to be offended by it. And it's not worth it to have this be the hill that we're dying on, or, that we're going to be spending the next week and a half explaining to people why, we're not obligated to pay the temple tax, or, something like that. If it's not worth it. There's bigger fish to fry. Just pay the tax.
Yeah, absolutely. I think here we see the pragmatic nature of what Jesus is saying when it comes to our obligations, to authority, right? Mm-hmm. And I agree with you when you pointed out that civil and religious authority are not so separated here. I mean, this is a tax, okay? This isn't a tithe. When we go to church, we can pay a tithe, but no one comes to our door if we don't. Right? It's an ethical thing. It's between us and God. This is a tax, okay? I don't know exactly all the details of the system, but presumably you could get thrown in jail for failing to pay it if you're a Jew, right? Because this is your temple, presumably, or you could get punished in some way.
Yeah, at the very least, there would be a massive social blowback, which I think is Jesus' point that he says to not give offense. So whether or not there would be a civil punishment, I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it gets complicated, and there's, because you have like provincial Jewish rulers who actually do have authority to kind of like make you do Jewish things if you're a Jew, even though it's under the Roman government. It's kind of complicated politically. So I don't know all the details off the top of my head. But this is a tax. That's the point. There's not too much of a distinction between civil and religious authorities. It's certainly not in the sense we would think in the 21st century with separation of church and state. That concept is non-existent, and it won't be existent for another nearly 2 millennia from the moment this pericope happens. So I don't know. You have this pragmatic understanding of like, you're not doing anything wrong to just kind of go with the flow. There's some things that are outside of your control, right? And there are some hills that are not worth dying on, even if it would be better if this weren't the case, right? Maybe the children are exempt, but look, at the end of the day, it's just money. It's not you. It's not your soul, right? It's something that you can give up for a greater cause. And so just pay the stupid tax, right? And I think in this way, even though this is talking about a more religious tax, I think it's very similar to Jesus's approach with the render to Caesar. I think it's like, what? Caesar's images on it? Fine, then give him his coin. Like, is this really worth like having a revolt and a war over so that we kill each other? Or like, is there something more important going on here? And so, again, I see this passage sometimes used. I've read libertarian arguments for why this passage like makes all taxation theft. And I'm like, no, you're doing something with the passage that's not there. As much as I would love for that verse to be in the Bible.
Oh, it'd be great.
It'd be so great. This whole episode would be so much more simple.
Yep.
Look, it's my bias too, but I just don't think that's here. Jesus just isn't going to do what you want him to do with this topic. He kind of evades it. He doesn't make a statement about whether it's right for the Roman government to tax or not. He just says that's the situation you're living in, and it's a stupid hill to die on. That's basically what I would summarize these two passages as saying, as far as Jesus's view on taxation.
And so I think in a sense that kind of answers the question of like, how should we think about taxes? Maybe it's a stupid hill to die on, but there's one more passage that I want us to get to, because I think there's a little bit more that we can squeeze out of the Bible in terms of what it has to say about taxation and how we should understand it. So we're going to return now to Romans 13. From our last episode, we're gonna take off the last 2 verses and sort of end the section before Paul kind of transitions to other things. So just recall from last episode that we talked about Romans 13, and you get this idea that people should be subjected to authority because authority is from God, and it goes through and we basically kind of made the argument that there's this idea that authorities, even if they're not like perfectly righteous or good, are still things that are instituted by God for the purpose of promoting like societal goods, like they punish evil and reward the good. So like they are servants of God, even if they aren't like trying to be necessarily, or even if they're not conscious of it. And by virtue of that, you should be in subjection to them. It says not only to avoid, verse 5 ends, therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, or just wrath in this case, not only to avoid wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So it's like, be in subjection because you don't want to be punished, and likely the kind of subjection-y thing that you would do would be evil anyway, and so you'd be violating your conscience, which kind of connects with Paul's point earlier in chapter 12 of don't do evil things, do good things. And he's sort of looping it in here. And so primarily there's this idea of like, don't do evil things, don't provoke these rulers to punish you, because don't go there is kind of basically Paul's point broadly. And and we made a little bit of application to the present day, which we'll kind of get to maybe at the end of the episode here, but that's a little bit of the context. So with that, we sort of end with this, therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath but also for the sake of conscience. And then we turn to verse 6. So, Jeremy, could you read us verses 6 and 7 from Romans 13?
Yes. Okay. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
Thank you. So, the reason why I was so excited to get to this is Paul is actually giving us a reason why we should pay taxes, where Jesus is, really more making primarily pragmatic arguments. I mean, he sort of asserts that Caesar is owed by virtue of the coin being his. But Paul actually here is actually giving us justification for taxes. He says, for because of this, namely the rulers being the ones who, reward evil and punish good, or sorry, have it backwards. Punish evil and reward good. It's like, for this reason, you also pay taxes. So Paul's actually making an argument to justify his claim that you should pay taxes. And so let's maybe get into that a little bit and figure out what does Paul really mean and what is his argument that he's kind of making here. But I sort of wanted to highlight that for people, sort of up front. So he says, for this you pay taxes, and it says, for the authorities, these rulers, are ministers of God. Now, this isn't the first time that we've had this description of rulers and their relationship with God. In verse 4, we had rulers being described as God's servants. And so in this passage, these rulers they're God's servants and ministers of God. And those words like servant and minister are interesting because they frequently kind of have religious associations, especially kind of in the present day. We would a lot of times understand, being God's servant or being a minister of God as something that's primarily religious in nature. And so it's interesting that that the rulers are described in this way. It almost kind of has this religious connotation to it. Now, we should be a little bit careful about importing our present day theological understanding of a word back into the text, which we've talked about a lot before of over
theologizing terminology.
Yes. Yeah, it's like
it's kind of like
James.
our read the Old Testament that used to be we'd say that on every podcast. I feel like recently every podcast has been don't overinterpret one word, right? With modern theological understandings when the Greek doesn't mean that.
Right.
I'm standing on this hill screaming this, right? You and I together, we want the world to know.
Yeah, standing on your hands, standing on your feet. So if you look at the word servant, and for this I used some Greek tools. I don't know Greek. I don't read Greek or anything like that. I'm relying pretty heavily on lexicons here.
All right, I'm ready to critique you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Jeremy's going to keep me honest. So just up front, I'm a layman, but if you look at the Greek word here that's rendered as servant, it's diakonos, which is where we get the English word deacon. So when it says he's God's servants, it's it's God's deacon would be sort of a overly weird or an overly wooden way of translating it. But, again, deacon, it sort of has religious connotations for us now, and it turns out that the actual word diakonos doesn't really necessarily carry any of that specific religious connotation. The word really just kind of means servant or assistant, kind of like a personal aid. The idea is that it's someone who does action on behalf of you. So the way that a personal servant would organize your calendar or write memos for you or go to a place and do a task on your behalf.
It doesn't always mean a deacon, an ordained person who has to follow the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3.
Right.
And this does actually, it's pretty important debate because you have Phoebe described as a diakonos in Romans 16, and then that it gets used in the debate concerning whether women should be deacons or not, whether, that's a valid biblical category. And it's well, Phoebe's a diakonos, but does that mean she's a deacon or does that mean she's a servant? And well, that's a good debate. That's
yeah.
It's important to not over theologize terms. Have I said that enough yet?
Yes.
To allow the words to mean what they meant to the original audience.
Right. Yeah, and so in this case, it's important that it's not deacon. It's really more just kind of servant or assistant. Now, importantly, if you're reading the ESV, this is something that I think is important to point out, is the ESV renders the Greek word for slave as servant. So if you're like reading at the beginning of Romans 1, it says Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ, where it's like Paul, the slave of Jesus Christ. And you can read in the foreword of the ESV of why they chose to translate things that way. But the thing that I'm pointing out is in this case, they're not saying that rulers are God's slaves, they're his servants. So not like in bonded servitude to him, but that they're like assistants, like doing things on his behest, is sort of the idea. And and this is connected with Paul's other more broad point of like the rulers are doing something for like on God's behalf, of namely rewarding good and punishing evil, that they like have a specific task that they're supposed to do. And that's the sense in which they're God's servant.
Hey, for someone who doesn't know Greek, that was pretty good lexical analysis, might I say.
Thank you. Thank you,
Jeremy. Good word study. You don't need to know the grammar to be able to distinguish between doulos and diakonos. You did a good job. So.
Hey, sweet. Okay, awesome. The second thing, so that's servants of God. Now we come to ministers of God, which is an even more kind of like religiously potent description. And so maybe you're thinking, well, maybe now we can bring our theology understandings, and the answer is still no. The word ministers here, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it.
Liturgoi.
Liturgoi.
Yeah.
Or something?
I would need to look at the actual Greek word, but.
Sure. Okay.
Goy would be correct because that's plural. So ministers.
Oh, hey. Okay, perfect. I copy and pasted it from BDAG properly then. No, so the description of ministers, if you kind of like look up its usage, it actually is in the Old and New Testament usage primarily a religious term. So it's the word that gets used to describe like priests in the Old Testament, well, specifically in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but then also in the New Testament referring to priests. So this is in places where you would see it, like they minister before the Lord, or ministers of God, referring to priests. In that case, the minister there is the same Greek word here for minister. There are a couple instances where this minister language gets used for like non-priestly activities, but the vast majority of the uses are specifically priestly. Now and kind of the idea, if I believe the Greek lexicons that I was reading, is that the notion here of ministering is it has the specific connotation of like doing a public service for someone. So in the way that like when priests minister before the Lord, it's they're like doing a public service like on behalf of Israel before God. That's the sense in which they are ministers or ministering. We also get the same idea in English in like describing different like governing authorities, actually. It's interesting. So like in the British system, you have like the Minister of the Interior or the Minister of Defense, or various ministries as like government organizations. And it's actually the same idea here of it's this person who is doing a public service or a public work like on behalf of a group of people is really kind of the idea of what's going on.
So you mean we could call them deacons? the deacon of the interior.
Okay, that's pretty cool though. I kind of do want to start doing that.
Maybe I'd like the government more if we just like put a more positive spin on it, right? The deacon.
The deacon of foreign affairs.
The deacon of investigation. The central deacon agency.
Yes.
Like what? I love the deep state now.
Yes. So in this case, when Paul is... So we're kind of doing a bit of a deep dive because I think this is really important, is that being described as ministers of God, even though minister can be non-religious in its usage, I think Paul actually does kind of mean us to understand this as slightly religious, or having religious connotations. Like, not saying that... ruling authorities are priests or, anything like that, or that they have some kind of like official religious capacity, but rather that he's using language that evokes in our minds the image of priests, those who minister before God, and he wants us to think categorically like that about ruling authorities, so that in the same way that priests are doing this public service before God on behalf of the people, ruling authorities do like public service on behalf of, you know, the people before God. And that I think Paul really is trying to have us kind of make a little bit of that connection. You know, not saying that they're officially religious leaders, but that they function in the same kind of way before God that priests do. So it's not that they're religious leaders, but that they are servants of God in the sense that they do God's bidding in some way, right? They have an official position of some sort that is recognized by the people. And in that position, they do something on God's behalf. And kind of like we said in the last episode, like Hitler was a diakonos of God, right? Like even evil rulers are doing something in place of God. They're just doing so evilly, right? Like, so that's not saying that, like, you know, they're good people. They're not necessarily making the claim that, like, you know, Tiberius Caesar's a cool dude, and that he should, quote unquote, be the Caesar, right? It's just saying that they are performing this service, you know, on God's behalf of some sort. That's kind of how I'm understanding it. So it's not religious, but it is using the term in a very analogous way to the civil realm, what the term is used of in priests, for priests in the religious realm. Am I getting that right? Yes. No, I think that's exactly the thing that's going on. And
like, it's more than just you did something to help somebody. Like, diakonos can mean that, but it seems to have a more serious spin in this passage. And I would agree, because of the way it talks about being a servant of God. I mean, you know, it's not just like they do some things, right?
Right. Yes. It's like, you know, all Christians are servants of God in the sense that we're, like, you know, doing things on God's behalf. But not all of us are like ministers of God. You know, we're not all rendering the public service before God in the same way that, like, you know, we would say that, like, you know, pastors or elders or overseers, or kind of whatever term, you know, you want to use in that case. There is a sense in which they are ministers of God in a way that lay people are not ministers of God. Like, there is actually kind of a distinction there, even if both could rightly be called God's servants. And I think there's the same thing that's going on here. It's not just that they're servants, they are ministers in this kind of other, more nuanced capacity of rendering public service. Yeah. Interesting. And we get more of this because we're told, you know, it's, you know, for this reason you pay taxes, for their ministers of God, attending to this very thing. So, you know, attending to the thing of, again, this is punishing evil, rewarding good. And so Paul's even, like, telling us, like, what is the public service that they're rendering? It's this, punishing evil, rewarding good. And, like, that is the service that they do, the public service that they do on, you know, on God's behalf. And so then Paul then makes this pivot, and he says, so pay to all what is owed them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, and he kind of goes on from there. And so he's making this argument that basically that by virtue of ruling authorities being ministers of God, they are owed taxes. Like, I mean, that's what Paul's point is right here. And checkmate, libertarians. Right. So let's just be really clear. Paul is absolutely saying that you should pay ruling authorities, like, they are owed taxes. Like, they are owed
that's an
revenue
important
in
nuance
some sense.
that isn't said in the Matthew passages. He says they're owed it.
Yes.
Like, it's not just do it pragmatically. They're owed it.
Yeah. And you might be able to make some kind of argument about the word render to Caesar, that render sometimes has connotation of, like, duty, that, like, you're to give because it's owed. But even that one is like, I can kind of see it, but here it's, like, way more explicit. Like, Paul is just saying they're owed taxes, so give them what they're owed.
They're owed respect and honor as well, it says.
Yes, yeah. But the interesting part is, again, because Paul has told us why they're owed the taxes, and it's because they're ministers of God. And so let's maybe do a little bit of analogy work here to maybe understand more of what Paul is actually saying. And so in this case, plenty of other places in the New Testament, we get examples of, like, us being told that we have financial obligations to ministers of God. So, you know, you get the famous passages of, like, you know, don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, where Paul uses that to make application of, you should pay your pastors and elders. Like, you should financially support them. Or, he does that also with, this idea of the worker's worth his wage. And there's plenty of other places where we're told to honor our, overseers and elders, and to financially support them. Like, there's all of these obligations that we as lay people are owing to the people who are like ministers of God in the religious sense of that word. And similarly, there were the same kind of obligatory duties in the Old Covenant as well. Like we just talked about the temple tax, that there was obligation to support the priests, the ministers of God in the Old Testament. And the same kinds of obligations still exist in the New Testament as well. It's, just overseers and elders in this case. And so here's why I think it's important that Paul is wanting us to think like elder when we hear minister of God referring to rulers. Because I think his point is that basically, like, the reason why we owe pastors and overseers like financial support is because they're doing like something for God on our behalf. It's like, they are shepherding us as our leaders and, caring for our souls, like preaching the word to us and like doing these tasks to serve us as their parishioners. And so they are then entitled to financial support by virtue of that. So because they are doing this public service, they are owed financial compensation by us.
So kind of how I'm understanding this is what makes this interesting is Paul's argument is not you owe your pastors with your very soul, therefore I'm going to throw you in prison if you don't give money to your pastor or to me, right?
No.
Instead, he says you have an ethical obligation to do this. And then he makes an argument, right? Don't muzzle the ox while it treads. The muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain thing is, a really, really big moment for him. It's like let the ox that's working for you eat. It's good for you and for the ox, right? It's good for everybody when you fulfill your ethical financial obligations, right? So what I find interesting is that we're talking about this whole idea of being owed, but the government doesn't do that. They throw you in prison if you don't pay your taxes, right? It is, for them, it is not so much an ethical obligation, although they will propagandize people into thinking that. It is a, like, do this or we'll throw you in prison sort of thing. I mean, they're happy to make it a pragmatic thing if you don't believe it's an ethical thing.
Right. But Paul is saying it actually is an ethical thing.
Sure. Yeah. But I think it's important to point out here, because we are talking about like the relationship between these two realms, that regardless of the ethics of the civil rulers taxing people, Paul doesn't think that the kingdom of God operates that way.
Yes, that's another important observation is the financial obligations are there's no temporal penalty associated with them in the New Testament. Like even in the Old Covenant, where you might have some kind of penalty for not paying an obligation. In the New Testament, it's all voluntary. It's like the Lord. I'm pulling it off the top of my head, but it's
2
like
Corinthians 9, I think, is what you're thinking.
Thank you. Yes.
Not giving reluctantly or under compulsion.
Yes. Yeah. For the Lord loves a cheerful giver.
Right.
And so
like the whole point is you should want to give. Right.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's and so in that case, like the kingdom of God operates in that kind of very voluntaristic, or voluntary. Maybe that's the right word. I'm getting my terms tossed around, but it's a voluntary thing. Like you should want to do this. It's good. You should long to do this good thing. And I think we should understand this. And so even though the state doesn't operate in a voluntary manner, it's not like, pay the taxes if you want to or not. It's, pay the taxes or we're going to throw you in prison. But Paul's still making the argument of like, yeah, but it's still good to do it. And it actually, in Paul's mind, it almost seems like it doesn't matter if the government is forcing you to do it or not. Because Paul is concerned about your heart primarily in this section in Romans. He wants you to be doing the right thing, to be, serving the Lord and honoring the Lord with your bodies and with everything that you do. And so for him, the point really is like, you should have the right posture about doing this thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's not, again, and this is why I think we made it kind of clear in the first 3 episodes. I think we talked about it a lot in our first part in this series. Just this idea of like, we're not trying to import modern political concepts into scripture, right? Like, and there's not necessarily one correct political viewpoint that a Christian can hold. And I just, when we come to this passage, I think we are mistaking really any of these three passages we've looked at today if we view them as trying to give us a theology of taxation. None of these are about that, which, you know, and
I would say this one is the most about that.
It's the most about that, but it's not. And even like the term they're owed it doesn't necessarily mean that like ultimately they have the right to do it. It's just more that like, you know, socially it's expected that you do it. Politically, like you're going to be in trouble if you don't. They are owed it. Okay. Even if in God's viewpoint, Caesar shouldn't be taking your money, right? Which I would say is true, actually. Most likely true, at least. You're still, they're still owed it. They understand it as they're owed it. They'll send their goons after you if you don't. It's expected that you do it. For all intents and purposes, they're owed it. Like, and you can pontificate and philosophize as much you want about whether Caesar has the right to do it or not. But guess what? He's doing it. Right?
Yes.
Like it's very much like, I don't know. Jesus and Paul aren't going into esoteric political philosophy ever. They never do that. Right? This is a contemporary thing we're imposing on them. They're just saying, look, he wants the money. And like, you don't have, I mean, what are you going to do about it? Like, you know, and
his face is on the coin.
His face is on the coin. It's actually such a, like, I don't want to say it this way because it makes it sound blasphemous, but it's almost like a dumb argument. It's like what your hick cousin would say, right? It's like such a like silly, you know, but it's actually a really good point. Yeah. You know, of course it is, because it's Jesus's point.
Right.
But yes. As someone who likes to think of myself as like an intellectual and I read philosophy and politics, it's kind of simple and dumb. And that's actually revealing that I'm dumb, right?
Yes.
Because my head's in the clouds instead of in the real world.
Right.
It's a rebuke on me that it comes across as unsophisticated. That's a better word for it. Unsophisticated. It's not dumb, certainly, but it's also not, you know, Aristotle or Spinoza, you know, getting at the very meaning of and the essence of things themselves, right?
Right, because we are the Pharisees asking if it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. I mean, we're not trying to trap Jesus and kill him, but I mean, like we are that person, you know.
We're talking about the wrong topic. Like,
yes.
We're altogether interested in the wrong things, you know.
Yes.
I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. You know, that maybe that's a better way of putting it. Than saying it's dumb. But it's true. They're just trying to deal with the real world, you know? Yeah. But here's the thing that's interesting about that, is that means that we actually are free biblically to have a lot of different opinions on these things. Christians probably shouldn't agree on everything. It's going to depend on our context. Like Martin Luther had a very different understanding of the way that the government and the church ought to operate together than I do. And I think that's totally fine. I mean, Luther lived in a very different era. Perhaps in his era, the conclusions he came to were what were best for the church. And so I can learn from him and then like also have a different opinion. And that's okay, because we're not talking about some major core issue of the faith here. We're trying to just apply Christian principles to the world around us. So when we read, I don't know, so I'm sort of getting off on a tangent. Although maybe we're at that point of the episode anyways, where we can start wrapping up and go on tangents. But I just think it's interesting. We've looked at all these passages today, and my opinion is sort of like, yeah, well, pay your taxes. And that's about all they say. Right? Like, pay your taxes, and you know, the authorities are there, and they ought to punish evil and reward good. And to whatever extent they do that, and your taxes are going to fund that, you're obeying God, right? And don't die on this hill, perhaps. But then we get into questions of like, well, the American Revolution was quite literally dying on this hill. Like,
yes, it was a tax
dying.
Like
some people died on hills, literal hills. Some Minutemen died on hills because we didn't like being taxed, right? Or our forebears here in America didn't. And I would argue that's totally fine and actually not against the spirit of these passages at all. But how do I get there? Right?
Yeah, give me your pitch, Jeremy. Give me your pitch. Let me maybe rephrase it before you get into it. Is we're saying, on the one hand, these passages 1,000% tell you to pay your taxes, and they also even give justification that rulers are in some sense owed taxes. And at the same time, we're also saying the American taxation system is theft and evil.
Right. And back in the 1770s or whenever the Declaration was signed, it was also theft, and they also had every right to start a war over it. So I think.
So how do we stitch all of those things together of it both being commanded, in some sense, like there being this interpretation of it saying it's commanded, and then also saying, but it's also theft.
Right. Yeah, well, so simply put, like, these passages don't say anywhere, really, that civil authorities have, like, the objective moral right to take money from people by threat of violence. They don't say that it's right to do that. And I don't think the scriptures really generally teach that. Now, there is, in the Old Testament, in the Law of Moses, there are taxes. So those are just. So I guess we can't say, like, objectively that all taxation is theft from a Christian perspective, because God has taxes in the Law of Moses. But we certainly can make the argument that the present system we're under is corrupt and unjust and has forfeited its right to rule us, including the right to extract taxes from the people. And I think the argument for that would just be the same argument as the one we made last episode about, like, yeah, authorities can be overthrown justly, and in fact, many times that has happened in history. And I would say the American Revolution is one of those. I don't think it's actually that important to get into the details of it. I would just say that as a general
you can listen to our last episode if you want us to talk more about it. But
yeah, we talked a little bit about it. I don't think the details actually matter that much. I mean, certainly if a government is not unjust, if a government is approximately just, you shouldn't overthrow it. But I think there could be a lot of different circumstances that could, render a government unjust and therefore worthy of being overthrown. And I don't think as Christians we can guess all the circumstances that might lead to that. I mean, the last 2 years have seen governments doing things that no government has ever done in the history of our, fallen human race. I mean, we're living in a very different era as of March 2020. So therefore, we ought to be producing different political philosophy as Christians about what to do about it. I mean, I don't think it should look exactly like the political philosophy of 2019 or of Martin Luther or of Augustine. And so we don't know the circumstances that will come, right? The church literally cannot meet because a virus exists. Well, church has been canceled before because of the bubonic plague, but I don't believe there was like a government edict for literally a year plus. I mean, maybe a week. I don't know. I don't think there's any analog to what we're going through right now in history, in other words.
Yeah.
So my whole point is, like, we have to be open to critical thinking about the era we live in and applying our scriptural knowledge to, okay, so what do we do? I don't know what to do. I don't have any answer. I do think that, the church should meet and civil disobedience should be used. I don't think that necessarily means we need to overthrow the government, right? So, but I don't know, maybe someone has a good argument for it. I don't know. I'm just trying to do what I can. And now I'm on a watch list. I'm
Yes.
literally saying I don't know. I don't probably think that's wise to do. But in the
to
days
the FBI agent who's watching this later,
in the days of the American Revolution, though, they just said, "Hey, this sucks, and we don't like it, and we're going to overthrow this government." And I think that's fine. I think that's totally fine. It just, it depends on all the historical circumstances. And I think one thing I'm getting at too is that there's a difference between Paul and Jesus telling you as a Christian to pay your taxes because you as an individual are powerless to change the state of the world, right? There's a difference between that and, like, hey, we have this organized militia of Minutemen with muskets who can just drive the British off. We could win this, right? Like, we could actually change it. That's very different. You're talking about a corporate group of people here, separate from the church, by the way. That's pretty crucial if you ask me. Separate from the church, but many of whom might be Christians, but it's not a church organization. And they're rising up to fight an unjust government. Well, that's fine. That's just the way of the world. It's fallen man. We don't like these guys. We want to be ruled by different guys. Let's drive them off, right? And Christians can do that with a clean conscience. It's different than, like, the IRS agent is at my door, so I'm just going to shoot him. Like, that would be completely unjust. That
Yeah.
would be
That'd be
absolutely
evil.
wrong. Even if you could make the argument that from a rights-based standpoint, your rights are being violated, you should have the right to defend yourself. Okay, but Christian ethics is about more than just rights. This is like, you're just senselessly causing mayhem. Pay your stupid taxes.
Yeah.
I think that's the way Paul and Jesus would understand it. Sorry, I know I've been ranting a while. I'll let you talk.
No.
One other element I want to throw in there is that, Jesus is combating the zealots when he's talking about this. And the zealots are a religious group of people who want to overthrow the Roman government. And they are very much, if you look into their background, they are very much mixing the Jewish religion with like political violent action, revolutionary behavior, right? And certainly Jesus and the apostles condemn the zealots. That's without question. So we also have to understand these passages in that context. Like, pay your taxes, don't be a zealot. That doesn't necessarily mean that all tax revolts are wrong. It just depends on the circumstances. Mm-hmm. I think that's everything I thought.
Yes, no, that's all great, Jeremy. I think maybe I'll just I have one more thing to say, and then maybe we can wrap up here. But I sort of have maybe I think the analogy between civil rulers and like pastors is actually very helpful in maybe getting people over the barrier of like, it's okay to resist authorities. Because I hear you talk, and I remember the way that I thought a number of years ago, and I probably would have like been a little cringy at some of the things that you're saying of like, what do you mean it's like okay to resist? And because we do sort of have, I don't know, I think our society is thoroughly propagandized against thinking in that way. But so maybe just a little bit of an analogy to maybe help people hear a little bit more of what we're really saying. And that it's not really that we're making an unbiblical or unreasonable argument. And that is, so like, just think about pastors for a moment. And this is like, pastors definitely owed financial support from us for the, service that they render. Don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. But suppose you go to a church where your pastor is like embezzling the money from the church. He's enriching himself. He's constantly browbeating you about how you need to be giving to the ministry of the Lord. You need to send in your seed offering so that you can then receive God's blessings, and is basically just all around abusing people and stealing, and that's the thing that he's doing as a pastor. Is it are you obligated to keep tithing to that church? Are you like obligated to keep giving that church money? Like, are you obligated to stay there indefinitely and continue to be abused and taken advantage of by this man? I think it's pretty obvious that the answer is no. That, like, certainly we're commanded to honor our leaders and support them, but there is, like we were talking about in the first episode of this series, there is a level of like egregious wrong that can be done where you then functionally abdicate your authority, where that pastor who's doing those activities, he's abdicated his authority, and like no one is obligated to be under his authority anymore, and you're totally fine to leave and to stop supporting him. Like,
it could even get bad enough that you would be morally obligated to oppose him.
Yes.
Like let's say it's not just embezzling funds, which I don't know, at that point it might already be bad enough. What if he's using the funds to pay off the parents of children he's abusing in the church?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like an even more extreme circumstance where I would say not only are you not obligated to keep giving, you're obligated not to and expose it.
Yeah, and you're probably obligated to hand the man over to the civil authorities to punish the evil.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's this piece where even very clear unqualified statements about the support that we should give to leaders has to be understood in the context of, but this isn't like a literally every single circumstance he calls himself a pastor, therefore this is applied. Like there are situations that you get opted out. And by the same token, it's like, I think that if that's true of pastors, it's probably also true of governing authorities. Again, I'm trying to maybe help people be able to hear a little bit more of what we're saying. And so if the thing that your state is doing is sufficiently evil, if what they're doing is sufficiently abusive, then they've abdicated their authority. And like, you are now no longer morally obligated to financially support them anymore. You're no longer morally obligated to, be under their authority. Now, in that case, it might, pragmatically, it may still be a good idea to do it. But you're not, but there's not the moral obligation that Paul is talking about here. But then I think there's a lot of gray area in the middle too of, it's like, so what if your pastor is not, doing all of those like straight evil things, but maybe he's just like, maybe your elder board is just unwise with money and they keep like putting money into all of these like church programs. They don't really do anything. They don't go anywhere. It's not like really helping anybody or serving the church, or, maybe they just aren't really good with their, money in that standpoint of, it's not that they're evil. Maybe they're just kind of low grade and incompetent when it comes to finances. It's like, well, I mean, does that actually free you from the obligation of financially supporting? Like, it's like, just because your pastor's unwise, does that mean he shouldn't get to eat? Like, I don't know. I think that one's a lot harder to argue.
It's gray area. If it's egregious enough, perhaps, but how would we know without all the details of the circumstance?
Right, which frequently we don't have access to.
Sure. But I mean, as an individual believer trying to judge this situation, is there a right or a wrong answer? You're the expert, actually, at that point. The Bible only gives us certain ideas and principles. You have to apply them with prayer, you know? So if you're trying to, start the American Revolution and you're, a colonist and you're a Christian, should I fight or should I not? I don't know. Like, that's actually kind of between you and God. There's not a single answer to that,
Yeah, can you do it with a clean conscience? And I think that tells you a lot.
I mean, Augustine, we don't need to get into it right now. Augustine has his just war theory, which I think is super helpful here. He puts forward principles like, can you win? Right? Like, that's a very simple, like, if you can't actually win the war you're trying to undertake, then all you're doing is senselessly killing people.
Yeah.
Like, so that's an important ethical, and goodness, that's a tough question to judge if you're an American colonist in the 1770s, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they probably thought it was kind of a long shot, but...
But I mean, it panned out pretty well for them.
It did pan, I mean, the Lord blessed, I think, the efforts, and...
Yeah.
But, like, I think it just kind of centers back to the point of, like, like a husband has authority over his wife, but not always. Pastor has authority over his congregation, but not always. Parents have authority over their children, but not always. Like, something can be generally true, and yet it still be right to rebel against the general truth if the context has changed. And we talked about that when we talked about the rest of Romans 13. And I think we also actually talked about it in part 1. A lot of these themes keep coming back, but it's like, this is all true. Generally speaking, obey the government, pay your taxes, don't give offense to anybody. Our citizenship is in heaven. Caesar might be a jerk, but like, he's kind of the one in charge right now. Yeah. So just deal with it and live in the real world. But maybe the circumstances are different, right? Yeah. Caesar asks you to deliberately disobey God. Now you've got a different circumstance. Yeah. Now you have to choose God over Caesar. But then there's a lot of gray area where it's like, well, he's not telling me to disobey God, but he's also kind of completely undermining everything about my life and happiness and
I really don't like it.
And public flourishing. Yeah. So then it becomes a question of, well, what's the cost of resistance? Is it worth it? Is it, pragmatically smart? Is it wise? That's the word here. Is it wise? Yeah. And that's a hard question, and not one that you can answer with just these passages on taxation. And so that's, I don't know, that's kind of why I feel like these passages aren't meant to address those sorts of things, They're not about that. And we should probably, we don't have time today, but we should probably look at other passages concerning, resistance to the government. Look at Daniel, look at the apostles. What did they do in the face of a government that clearly wasn't rewarding good and punishing evil? How did they respond to it in those circumstances? And that might be of a little more help to us when deciding what to do when the general truth has gone out the window, you know?
Yeah.
And also just deciding when the general truth has gone out the window is tricky.
Yes.
When is it bad enough, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not happy with the current state of things, but I don't
Wait, really?
I don't know how to. Well, it's like it's a good question. It's like, man, we now have a federal government that pushes like gender revisionism, like just denying the most fundamental aspects of reality. Those are now in question, and we have governments like in Canada, you can be imprisoned or fined a hefty fine for not going along with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a new world. Okay, that's something that Christians just did not have to deal with until now.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do about that? I don't have any answers. My answer is the question. I don't know. We have to talk about it. What happens when they come for our churches? How does resistance look?
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
Yeah, I don't think I have a clean answer on it either, but I think the thing that we can say is there's a lot of space for different perspectives and different choices where people can, with clean consciences and in like honor to God, come to different conclusions on this. And I think it's okay, you know, that, yeah, I don't think we need to necessarily be fighting each other.
No, yeah.
On a lot of this, so.
Yeah, the kingdom of God is different than the kingdoms of this world. And as Christians, we ought to do good in the world, and that may include, you know, civil service in the government, or it may include being a part of a movement to change the government, right? It depends on where you're at. Both of those are okay. It's just not the church. I think that's the right.
Yes.
Like let's keep that distinction. But just because you're a Christian in a church doesn't mean that you enacting some sort of political change or action is wrong.
Yeah.
That's a huge mistake that a lot of people make. These big Eva types, you know, like the Tim Kellers of the world, who
we had to dunk on Big Eva one more time.
Man, any opportunity to talk poorly of Tim Keller is a good one.
Oh gosh,
they really these guys neutralize evangelical political action by just claiming like, well, yeah, but the church is like not of this world. It's like, yeah, but I am, okay? I have children. Like, there's nothing about, what about love your neighbor as yourself? I thought we were supposed to do good things in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Now, granted, being on Twitter all day and watching Ben Shapiro owning liberals compilations is not doing anything good for the world. but like yeah. as a general concept, a good point. As a general concept, though, like political action's important. Like some Christians should be doing it. Not all, not most, but some, somewhere should be doing it. Yeah. And there's nothing contradictory to, I don't know, to the spiritual nature of the kingdom of God there. I just had to find a way to dunk on Tim Keller in this episode, man. It's just impossible not to do it.
Well, I mean, there we go. I mean, that's all I have. Do you got anything else?
That's it. Pay your taxes, but it's okay to be a little bit annoyed as you do it. Is that the conclusion?
It's okay to come to different conclusions.
Maybe I'm justifying myself here, but
I think so.
I've been thoroughly convicted. I've been thoroughly convicted by this episode, and I think our conclusion is just sort of like, don't read too much into passages that aren't about what you might think they're about, right? Mm-hmm. It's okay for us to disagree on some of these things. That's my spiel here at the end.
Yep. Well, in the immortal words of the philosopher Porky Pig, that's all, folks. We thank you for joining us. If anything you heard today has sent you into a blind theological or political rage, feel free to lambaste us on social media. Alternatively, if you liked what you heard, have Bible verses you want us to break down, or questions you think we can answer, you can send them to thejohn315podcast@gmail.com. That's thejohn315podcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.